Welcome to The Bridge. We have a special guest. Today's guest is co-author of Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa. He is vice chairman at the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, a coordinator for the Schiller Institute, vice chairman of BRIX, B-R-I-X, the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, and a distinguished research fellow at the Guangdong Institute for International Strategies. Welcome to The Bridge, Hussein.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction.
Well, I mean, it's quite an introduction. Actually, I had to take details out. There's so much to fit in there. Okay, so I wanted to start with, you just recently came to China, and that's what our show is primarily about. So you went for a tour of economic, social, and cultural realities on the ground in Xinjiang. We'd like to know about your experience. For example, did you see people speaking in their local minority languages? Were people free to practice Islam and so forth?
Yeah, well, thank you. This was a very, very amazing trip for me. It was a big surprise, although I thought I knew a lot about China and Xinjiang, but this was completely surprising for me. It also makes me think, like I was asking these questions before, it's stupid to ask if people speak their language, if the Uyghur language is used, and all these questions, they sound very silly for me now, because the reality is completely the opposite of everything we have heard about Xinjiang and how people live there, what they do, what do for work, what kind of culture is there, what is kind of language is there. So there is a very famous Muslim thinker and leader, Imam Ali bin Abi Talib. He was the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad. In one of his speeches, he said, the distance between truth and falsehood is 4 fingers. And they asked him, what do you mean? And he put his hand like this. And he said, it's the difference between saying I heard and saying I have seen. And that makes a big difference. And what I have seen myself firsthand is completely different. So this is a proof that...
Could you give us a couple of examples? What precisely did you see?
Okay, for example, starting from this question of the use of the Uyghur language. As soon as I landed in Urumqi airport, the big sign on the airport, this huge sign, it is in Uyghur language. I recognized it because it is in Arabic letters, because the Uyghur language, they use Arabic alphabet. So I could read it, Urumqi, in my own way. I am an Arabic speaker. So you start from the airport, every sign in the airport, every public space sign is in Uyghur and Chinese. All the road signs, all the signs on the subways, public spaces, restaurants, everywhere you go, the Uyghur language is everywhere. And people speak their language. In the airplane, I heard people, I can recognize it because it sounds a bit like Turkish language. I am not a Turkish speaker, but I can distinguish between Turkish, Arabic, Kurdish, and Persian. So this is a very simple thing. This is the first thing you are met with, which shows you this. And then there's this other issue is that Xinjiang, I mean, Urumqi, Kashgar, Korla, which was my big surprise, these are advanced cities. You took go from the airport to the city, to the hotel, and you have all these amazing highways. The urban infrastructure is top notch. It's European level. It's not even, other developing countries. This is a completely different place than you imagine. And the housing, all the fantastic urban development, real estate development projects, it's completely different than the perception you have. Even if you have a positive idea about Xinjiang, you will be still surprised, let alone having all the negative images in your mind, which is generated by narratives in the Western media. So I met with Uyghur people, I interacted with them, I learned a lot about how they live, how they do. Actually, the first day I arrived there, it was the day before the end of Ramadan. And because I was in a big delegation of journalists and reporters and experts from Belt and Road countries, most of them were from Muslim countries. So we asked at the hotel, tomorrow morning, there is the morning prayer of the Eid al-Fitr, the end of Ramadan. And we're supposed to go to a mosque before dawn, before the sun rises. So we asked if it's possible to go to the Kashgar main mosque, which is famous. They said the Kashgar main mosque is a bit far from the hotel. We cannot arrange it, but there's a mosque here nearby where the locals go for prayer, and we can easily get you a taxi and go there. So, at like 5 o'clock in the morning, I was dressed actually in traditional Moroccan dress, Arabic dress, and we went there, and the Muslims there were praying. We went in, and they were a bit surprised to see foreigners in that little mosque. We prayed with them, we saluted them, we congratulated them for the Eid, and then we went back. So this was not like something somebody arranged. It was like a surprise visit we paid to the local mosque people. So
I saw that you went to another mosque as well in some of the videos that you posted. So you went to the main mosque as well later?
Yeah, during the day, went to the main mosque in Kashgar, which is the Idkar Mosque. It's a very historical, traditional mosque, beautiful, fantastic. It has been renovated. The Chinese government is spending enormous amounts of money. This is the other surprising. The Chinese government and the CPC are investing enormous amount of money to preserve the culture, the monuments, the traditions, the books, the epics, the poetry, and the music of the ethnic minorities. Mm. They are investing in it.
It's interesting.
So this mosque was such an example where, because it was like in a primitive shape before, but the imam there who took us on a guided tour, speaking his Uyghur language, actually, through a translator, he explained for us how this mosque has been renovated and, and put back into its original shape. There's also a huge carpet, hand-made carpet in the middle of the mosque, which was a gift from the President Xi Jinping, which has a very beautiful pomegranate flowers, 56 pomegranate flowers. And he said every flower represents one Chinese ethnic group. So for the Chinese government, the Chinese people, being, Uyghur, Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, anything, this is not a problem. This is actually a part of the wealth of the nation. The nation is wealthier, richer culturally with more ethnic groups. So instead of being a problem of separatism, it actually has become a way of uniting the people of China. And therefore, both the government, but also many other agents and media, they are encouraging people from the rest of China to go to Xinjiang and see for themselves the richness of the culture there. Last year there were 250 million visitors from the rest of China to Xinjiang. This is 10 times the population of Xinjiang. And the population of Xinjiang is 25 million. Like Shanghai is 26 million people in the city. But Xinjiang, which is a sixth of China's area, has only 25 million, but 250 million tourists from the rest of China visit Xinjiang. Wow. And this is strengthening the bonds of the Chinese people, and actually enriching the people of Xinjiang itself, because tourism has become a very important source of income. But also, that's not all. This is another thing I found surprising about Xinjiang, is not that this is not like a people living a traditional life. People are living a very modern life. All the stuff you see, and I actually criticize some of the people in the Chinese media because they only show the Uyghurs in traditional clothes and traditional dance in the old city. This is not how Uyghurs live in Xinjiang. They live in modern apartments and houses. They have nice cars. They don't dress like this the whole time because their life has advanced, they modernized. But what you find in Xinjiang, for example, the other misconception is that, it's a place where they produce cotton and textiles. That cotton and textiles is not the big business there, or producing fruit, nice fruit. They are very good fruit, but that's not the big.
And walnuts and almonds.
I bought these huge walnuts. I was very surprised, and the raisins, everything is beautiful. But that's not the main economic activity in Xinjiang. The main activity in Xinjiang exports is energy, oil, gas, and coal. Okay? Number two is not cotton or textile. Number two is machinery, advanced heavy machinery, and cars. And now with the new development zones being built, Xinjiang will be producing electronics, household appliances, all kinds of products, advanced products, digital things, telecommunications, and a lot of it is dedicated to transport, to export to neighboring countries in Central Asia who are growing very much as important partners of China, but also West Asia, the Arab world, and the rest of Europe. So Xinjiang, as I thought before, Xinjiang is just a bridge where there are railways, and then the important stuff is produced in Shenzhen, in Chongqing, and Chengdu, and sent by rail through Xinjiang to Europe. But that's not the reality. The reality is that these things are now produced in Xinjiang itself, a lot of it. And the government last year invested $70 billion. You know, that was also another mind-boggling thing. Only last year, the central government invested $70 billion in Xinjiang. Infrastructure, industry, social. You know how much that is? You know, between 2015 and 2019, China invested only $60 billion in all African countries in 5 years. But in 1 year in Xinjiang, the government invested more. So there's a very clear policy to turn this region from, you know, previously plagued with terrorism, extremism, poverty, to a rich region, because the principle is not to help Xinjiang, but to make Xinjiang stand on its own feet economically and become a source of wealth for the rest of China. You know, teach a man how to fish rather than giving a man fish every day. So I saw this as a very clear principle. We visited many industrial zones. I saw some of them from the air. I have filmed it you know, from my seat on the airplane, the huge industrial zone in Urumqi. And I will, of course, I will show all this. I have going to do a series of films, but also I'm writing a series of articles on the economic, cultural, social aspects of life in Xinjiang, which everybody needs to know about.
Well, before we move on to other questions, why don't you tell us where is the best place that we can find your articles that you publish?
It's on our website of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. It's www.bricssweden.org.
Fantastic. You know, your experience is similar to mine. I went last year, so I guess I was one of the 250 million people, if that's the amount of people that went there. And one of the things I did see was a car factory. So I was like, oh, wow, this is really kind of quite surprising. But your experience is very similar to mine. I went to a square at night, my first night in Urumqi. And I just saw, you know, some Uyghur gentlemen, and they weren't dressed up in traditional attire. They were playing basketball. So they were just like, you know, out at night doing some exercise with their friends. And I was like, oh, you know, there were different times when I did see people dressed up in traditional attire, but that was more for like special events, special occasions. Most people were just dressed, you know, in jeans and you know, modern clothes and stuff. So I think that's fascinating. Thank you for telling us a little bit about that. Now, you mentioned the Belt and Road, and you're with the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. Not everyone understands what the Belt and Road is, because it's not just really one thing. It's kind of a whole network of ideas. And you, as someone who is an expert in that topic, I've been wanting to have you on the show for a long time. I just want to be honest. Could you tell us a little, tell everyone who doesn't really understand the Belt and Road, including me, what is the Belt and Road?
Okay, I think my understanding of the Belt and Road Initiative is a bit deeper than other people, because since the 1990s, through the Schiller Institute, we were developing the idea of what we first called the Eurasian Land Bridge, or the New Silk Road. We published books on that. This is the first book. It was published in January 1997. It's called the Eurasian Land Bridge, the New Silk Road, Locomotive for Worldwide Economic Development. And we included actually even maps of how Eurasia can be connected with infrastructure. So we already, since that time, with the Schiller Institute and an economist called Lyndon LaRouche, he's American actually, We're promoting the connection between countries, regions, and continents through what we call development corridors. The development corridor, all these lines on the maps we use, not others, they represent a corridor, a belt, which is 100 to 150 kilometers wide. In the center of it, if you have river, then you use that river as an infrastructure or canal, and then you build highways, high-speed rail, and around these you build, you will have oil and gas pipelines, electricity lines, but around them you build industrial and agricultural and urban centers. So that nations who are landlocked, like in Central Asia, have lots of natural resources, but they are cut from the world, they are cut from technology, can integrate that technology into their natural resources. Some other countries have human resources, but they don't have natural. So you connect all these regions, and each nation will be able to use its own advantages in this cooperation. So these are development corridors, and we prefer the ones on land, because in the sea, when the ship is sailing, it cannot build things on the road. But when you build a railway, you can build things around the railway. This is how America was built, through the transcontinental railway. From the East Coast to the West Coast. Along the railway, you had new cities, you had new agriculture, new activities taking place. That's the importance of infrastructure. And therefore, when President Xi Jinping announced, we organized dozens of international conferences, seminars, we published other books, and been talking with experts all over the world. Actually, we expanded this to the World Land Bridge to connect America through Alaska and the Bering Strait to Eurasia. So that's actually included in our new plan. And so anyway, when President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, we immediately saw this is really promising. This is very important that a major economic power is considering this. And President Xi Jinping, when we looked at his thinking, looked at how he described this, he calls this one, the belt, the economic belt of the Silk Road. This is very important to remember what I told you about the development corridor. President Xi Jinping means that what the Belt and Road brings is not goods trafficking from A to B. That's not the purpose of the Belt and Road, especially the economic belt, is to bring development to all the regions between A and B, between China and Western Europe. That's the concept. And therefore, trade will become, of course, as a byproduct of that. Most of the world trade is going by sea, by the way, not by railways, but railways and roads help to bring development to different regions, nationally and internationally. So the Belt and Road Initiative, when it was announced, there was a lot of confusion, but in 2015, the Reform and Development Commission of China issued a policy paper called Jointly Building the Belt and Road, the vision of that. And it identifies the 5 principles of the Belt and Road. The most important, the first one is political coordination, which means that China will coordinate its development policies with the development policies of the respective nations who enter that agreement, which means that China will not impose its own policies, but the development goals of that nation and the development goals of China will be coordinated. So you find where the common goals are. Most of the projects China is building are not proposed by China. All the projects China is building in Africa, these were proposed by the African nations themselves as part of their national development plan. China says, we provide you the tools for your own development because we don't understand how your country, that's your country. We don't tell you what to build, where to build it, but we can help you build what you want to build, where you want to build it. And we will provide you, of course, with the credit and so on. So this is number one, political coordination. It's not about politics. It's about coordinating the policies of development. Number two is the financial coordination, how to find the financial resources jointly to build these projects. Free, unimpeded trade. And of course, we have also the people-to-people communication, which not only tourism, but also research and joint work by universities.
Scientists, agronomists, yeah.
So there are five main principles, which are the basis for a comprehensive kind of joint economic cooperation. And of course, China is developing what is called joint comprehensive strategic cooperation agreements. These are very long-term cooperation agreements. It's like the one signed with Saudi Arabia in 2022 and with Iran 2023, which like these are 25-year-long plans. The people put a price tag on it. It's $400 billion or five. That's not the issue. But for example, oil-rich countries can use their oil as a leverage, credit leverage, financial leverage to get Chinese machinery and goods and technology. So you exchange the oil for construction. We had a similar plan in Iraq.
Yeah. But it was how many schools? That was 2,000 schools? How much was that? It was a lot.
No, it was more than that. It was infrastructure, railway, water management, power, industries, agriculture. These 1,000 schools is like what is left over from it.
Iraq, that's the only one that I knew about. So you're teaching me a bunch of other things that I need to go and research.
I was protesting against the Chinese media when they say, "Oh, we're going to build 1,000 schools in Iraq." I said, "Look, this is just peanuts. This is not the reality. This is they want to cover the reality." I made a study. Iraq needs 25,000 schools immediately, not 1,000, because for 40 years no schools were built, and the old schools are destroyed. So we need 25,000 schools immediately, and then every year we need 5,000 more schools because the Iraqi population doubled from 20 million to 40 million in the last 20 years, and it will double again by 2050. So
financing that's going to be complicated.
Yeah, the actual agreement was much more deeper and wide than that. So this is one important thing. Then
if you have a paper on that specific topic, please send it. I'll put a link to it in the YouTube video of this interview because I think a lot of people would be interested to learn more about that.
Yes. I have a previous article. I actually 2020 when President Trump decided to assassinate the Iranian general in Baghdad, I wrote an article because the Prime Minister of Iraq, who was in the government then, he was forced to resign. He was the one who signed the agreement with China. So I wrote that article to point out that the real background to that is to kill this Iraq-China agreement, because that was very promising. And I visited Iraq, I met the former Prime Minister, and we agree on many things. And we still have in Iraq a movement, which I am a part of. It's called the Silk Road Movement. And every Friday we have sittings and rallies in different Iraqi cities demanding to join the Belt and Road and work with China on a comprehensive development plan. So this is but going back to the Belt and Road, now the Belt and Road is two parts. Of course, the economic belt, which goes on land, and then we have at the same year, 2013, President Xi Jinping announced the launching of the Maritime Silk Road from Indonesia. The first one he announced from Kazakhstan, which is a reminiscent of the Silk Road, old Silk Road. So these two make the Belt and Road. Now, the economic belt has 6 main corridors or development corridors. One is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is very, very important because the components there are mainly energy. Because Pakistan's big, Achilles heel is the lack of energy, but also roads and railways. But energy is very key. We have the China, Central Asia, West Asia corridor, which extends all the way to Syria and the Mediterranean and the Gulf countries. We have the China, Mongolia, Russia corridor. We have the China-Europe corridor, the Eurasian corridor. And then we have the China, Indochina, which now goes through Laos to Thailand and the rest, Vietnam and those other countries. We have also a corridor which is not formally accepted, is like the China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, India corridor. So we hope that by time China, India can also normalize their relations and become, these are two giants of Asia, have to work together. their neighboring countries.
Yeah, and I would love to see that happen. They have so much to gain from working together. I have a quick question before we get to the next question, and maybe we can keep this one a little bit shorter. I think you were talking with Warwick Powell, Professor Powell from Australia, and you guys were talking about the digital Silk Road. Could you just give us a little, what is that? What is a digital Silk Road?
Okay, well, I think we know all digital communication in the world is through cables in the oceans. These also from the old telegraph cables, which extended from Britain and Europe to Asia and America. These are undersea cables, but more than 90% of them are controlled by a few American corporations, Google, Amazon, and others, and Meta, so forth. So these are strategically problematic for lots of nations because all transfer of information nationally and internationally is being conducted through these cables. So China and I think many other nations are interested in building their own cables, digital cables extending from China, Asia to Middle East, Africa, and even the Mediterranean. There are a large number of them actually when I looked at it, which is not very well known. I mean, Huawei and China Telecom and others, they're building these cables in the seas to communicate and have an independent communication avenue for also both, with trade partners and others. But this is also, it will increase the capacity of the global digital network. So it's not like only a strategic security consideration, but it's also a practical consideration. Many nations in Africa are beginning to build digital networks, and the only partner they have in that is China, in the telecom and G5, every aspect of telecommunications. So this is very important.
Okay, the next question I'd like to ask you is a little bit of it's one I like to ask other experts like yourself when we're talking about the Belt and Road, because this is the most common thing that gets thrown out there about the Belt and Road by people who don't know much about it. Are the investments by AIIB and by Exim Bank and other Chinese financial institutions or Chinese related financial institution, do these constitute debt traps?
Yeah, well, this is the very typical question, but it has been actually debunked thoroughly by others and myself by looking at case studies that are famous, like the so-called Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. This was done by a professor, Deborah Brautigam from the Johns Hopkins University. She traveled to Sri Lanka. She got all the documents about the contract, but she discovered actually that China, by leasing the port, bailed out and saved Sri Lanka in 2017 because Sri Lanka was in deep debt to Western financial institutions, private and public, and they were about to go bankrupt because they were not able to pay that debt. So the Sri Lankan government offered the port for leasing for $700 million, and nobody accepted that offer except China. And China gave the money to the Sri Lankan government for leasing the port. And what did the Sri Lankan government do with the most part of the money? It paid its debt to Western banks and financial institutions.
So rather than a debt trap, it turned out that the Chinese finance was going to Western institutions to pay for their debt trap.
Exactly. There is a debt trap, but it was created by Western institutions in collaboration with the World Bank and IMF. In 2022, when the Sri Lankan government defaulted on the debt, and there was a huge crisis, actually, a consulting company asked me to look at this story. And I looked at 3 years of 4 years of Sri Lanka's financial books through the central bank, publicly available books, and different ministries, whatever I could get hold of. And then I discovered that Sri Lanka's crisis has nothing to do with China. It has to do with the terrorism which struck Sri Lanka, which destroyed the tourism. Tourism was the big industry in Sri Lanka. And there was a terrorist attack in 2017. And then COVID completely eliminated the tourist industry. That was the largest income of Sri Lanka. Then you had the energy crisis because of the Ukrainian war. Sri Lanka imports almost all its energy needs. And the prices went up, the dollar went up, so the country could not, it was on its knees. And then I looked who owns Sri Lanka's debt. So I discovered that China owns only 10% of Sri Lanka's debt. Western institutions, private companies, financial companies like BlackRock, American, and Ashmore in Britain, they own 47% of all Sri Lanka's debt in Euro bonds. And these bonds are merciless. They are short-term and they have very high interest rate. But nations sometimes are forced to go borrow from these markets to fill gaps in their deficit. But they are not invested in anything productive. So I've discovered that 90% of the debt actually belongs to Western institutions. The same thing applied to Pakistan and Zambia, which I also studied. So there is no basis. The other thing, which is a very important thing in economy, is that if the Chinese debt loans, they go to finance infrastructure. What does that mean? Well, your country becomes more productive because without energy, transport, water, and skilled labor, you cannot generate income. So that Chinese infrastructure is helping those countries to become more productive. They can use their natural resources, their land, to produce agriculture, produce industrial goods, or whatever. So China is actually helping those countries pay back their debt. And the loans are very long-term, very low interest. Like the highway in Montenegro, although the agreement was confidential, the Montenegrin government published it because there was a lot of tension. And I discovered this was the silliest contract. It was actually to the disadvantage of China because the loan is like 20 years long and the interest rate is only 2%. Commercial loans are not less than 5%.
So they could just buy US treasuries and China would make more money investing in almost anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, if China is interested in money, they will lend money to banks and financial institutions, not to build highways and railways. Right. So these differences people don't understand, but the media and the think tanks and politicians, they use the lack of knowledge of economics and finances and getting hold of the real information, which I did. But it was a lot of hard work to find that information and analyze it. So there is absolutely no truth to the China debt trap, but there is a debt trap, and that debt trap was created by Western institutions.
I want to move on to some specific kinds of projects. I use the College of William and Mary's website, which is an interactive map, and you can see all over Africa there are hydropower plants everywhere. Most of them, like you said, there are 2% interest loans that are 15 or 20 years maturity. Sometimes they're, backed by cocoa beans in Ghana's case. So I was wondering, what is the purpose of building hydropower plants? How does that help these developing countries economically?
Well, the answer is very simple. You need electricity to have a modern society. That children can read at nighttime, do their homework, that factories can work, that hospitals can function. Everything is dependent today on electricity. So without power, you simply cannot have a modern economy. You will live in perpetual poverty and darkness. So that's one thing. Africa has enormous hydropower potential, which was never used. And Europeans and the Americans were never interested because you cannot export that to Europe and the United States. So they were opposed. Then they used two factors. It's a trick of two throngs. First, they say hydropower is harmful to the environment, harmful to the fish and the wildlife and all this stuff. Second, they say it's not financially sustainable because those countries don't have money to build the hydropower. And the electricity which will be generated will not pay back all these loans. Now, that's really, not only wrong, I think it's criminal to prevent nations from development. All nations have built hydropower. I mean, China is a great example. But at the same time, they try to mitigate the consequences for nature, for people. But there is no other way than development. Actually, development can give you much better environment, because poverty is the worst enemy of the environment. Because you look at Africa, what do people use for energy? They cut wood, they burn the forest. But if you have a clean source of energy like hydropower, I'm an advocate of nuclear power, actually. Even coal power should be allowed to be built in Africa. Africa has lots of coal reserves, but they are prevented from building coal power, while everybody else in the world is using coal power. But they are telling the Africans, no, it's not good. If you start burning coal, the world will collapse, like Obama told people in South Africa. He told them, if you want to have a nice house, air conditioning, and a car, every one of you, the world will collapse. So you better not have it. But I have an $8 million villa in Washington. That's fine. So wow. There's a lot of hypocrisy. But hydropower is very important. In my book, we list actually the potential of the whole African rivers. It's enormous amount. Like only the Congo River, you can produce 100,000 megawatts. The Three Gorges Dam in China, to give a benchmark, is the largest in the world. It produces 20,000 megawatts of power. That's capacity. One series of dams, it's called the Grand Inga Dam on the Congo River, can produce 40,000 megawatts. That's double the Three Gorges Dam. But the whole Congo River, including its tributaries, if you will have, it will be 100,000 megawatts. That's 5 times more energy than the Three Gorges Dam of China. Now, you can also look at, there are other rivers in Africa. Of course, all these things have to be studied and weighed and all things, but you cannot say from the beginning, no, it's not good, it's not good for environment, we don't have money. That's the wrong way of looking at things. So that's the kind of development which is now happening. Look at Ethiopia. Ethiopia, they have the rivers, the Blue Nile and the Amo River, which flows into Kenya. And there's enormous power generation potential, but they were told, no, you can't do that. This is dangerous. And then they moved some people in Egypt saying, oh, if you do that, we will blow the dam because you will stop the water from coming to Egypt. All that nonsense. The current Egyptian government does not believe in that. So the Ethiopia, the World Bank, the IMF, the United States, the EU, everybody, they said no to financing the dams. So the Ethiopian government, they did a very smart thing. They went to the Ethiopian people at home and the diaspora and they said, look, this is a life and death issue for our country. We need electricity to get out of poverty. So we are intending to finance this ourselves by issuing bonds to build the dams. Actually, China also contributed to that, but also they managed to get neighboring countries to pay for the dams because they will get electricity in the future. So that way, Ethiopia has now managed to increase its energy supply by 100 times by building these dams. And at the same time, you can regulate the water flow because the Nile River is very erratic. It's very, you have all the rain which falls in 3 months. So you will have floods in Sudan, for example, every year around August, September, horrible floods every year. Sometimes they extend all the way to Egypt. And these dams will help save Sudan from the floods, but they will still continue to get the water, but in a more regulated way.
So maybe even farmers can take advantage of that because they'll know when the governments are planning on releasing the water.
Exactly. You can regulate the water. So you're not only producing energy, you are regulating the water for agriculture. And so you can have a safe, secure, well-planned agriculture. You look at Ethiopia, it's not related to the dams, but Ethiopia, through 2 5-year plans and reforms of the agriculture, they now produce their own food. Because every time we used to hear Ethiopia, the name Ethiopia was associated with famine.
Yes.
Because we had all these television images, famine in Ethiopia in the 70s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, always famine in Ethiopia. Now Ethiopia has moved away from that by reforming the agriculture, supporting the agriculture with modern technology. And now they have, actually last year I wrote an article, they exported for the first time avocados to Holland using Yeah, using cooled containers on the railway, which was built by China from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, and from
Wow.
there it goes by sea. These things people don't hear about Ethiopia. The only thing they hear about Ethiopia is there's a civil war. There's now the guy who got Nobel Prize now is a dictator. So, things change and shift. So, no, there are very positive things. Look, Ethiopia was admitted into the BRICS plus nations. Why is that? So
your answers
if
are
it's
so extensive that I now realize that we're not going to be able to get through all of our questions. But I want to try to, so I'm going to try to choose the best questions. In terms of criticisms, a lot of people, again, who don't know that much about the Belt and Road, don't know a lot about economics. They assault the Belt and Road for neo-colonialism. They say, oh, China is just trying to extract resources. And China uses a policy called win-win diplomacy, win-win economic cooperation. So I guess the question is, what is China getting out of helping developing countries develop the infrastructure they need to increase their prosperity? What is China getting from this?
Well, China has the right to get energy security. That means it can buy the oil and gas and coal it needs from other countries and pays for that. That's very natural, legitimate trade. Nobody should stop that. There are other nations who have less natural resources, but they would like to exchange their natural resources for useful infrastructure. So China is offering that. Other countries don't offer that because other countries simply, for a practical reason, don't have government-owned oil companies who can buy the oil and then pay, make other companies, government-owned companies, to build the infrastructure. So China has a legitimate right to have access to natural resources in other countries, but it's not stealing these resources. It's not forcing those countries to give their resources like the West has done to Zambia. In my study of Zambia, I was surprised to find out that almost 90% of Zambia's copper resources, which is one of the biggest in the world, is controlled by 7-8 British registered companies. And they pay almost nothing to the Zambian government. China also has a company there, but it's much smaller than the big British ones. And, France still controls large chunks of the now being kicked out of West Africa, the uranium, the gold, and all these mines. They're all controlled by, the oil in Nigeria, still Shell, Royal Dutch Shell was. So these nations are getting out of that control. They are fighting to get out of that control. But that is the neo-colonialism, not China. China says, okay, I have a legitimate right to buy it from you. I will pay you the fair price you ask for, or if you want, we can exchange that for infrastructure. So absolutely, there is nothing wrong about that. What is wrong is that the IMF and forced a country like Zambia to privatize its copper mines in order to get some loans.
The Washington Consensus.
Yes, and they not only had to do that, but that they to promise the foreign companies that they will repatriate all their profits. And they pay almost nothing in taxes. All Zambia gets is like 6% of the revenues from the copper mining taking place in their country by British, Australian, Canadian companies. This is a crime. But it was imposed and the Zambians have to accept it. And then somebody comes, Janet Yellen was in Zambia, the head of the IMF was in Zambia. All kinds of American officials were in Zambia last year because they wanted to make Zambia a model. Why? Because they said, okay, we want to help you with your debt problem, but you should stop building infrastructure because you don't have money for infrastructure, and stop taking loans from China to build infrastructure because you can't afford it. So we want to help you, but stop building infrastructure with credit. And
stop creating the mechanisms you need to become prosperous, and everything will be just fine.
Exactly. So how would Zambia get out of the debt trap? Well, they have to build infrastructure. They have to take back their copper and start like Zimbabwe is doing now. They say, we will not allow anybody to export raw lithium.
Mm.
We will only allow lithium batteries export.
Mm. So
Are
the
you
finished
willing to
product occurs inside the country, and they can make more profit.
Because you export the raw materials.
Mm-hmm.
I know this from Iraq and the oil, petroleum. You export the raw oil to, Japan, Korea, even China. They pay you $60 a barrel. But what they do with the oil by petrochemicals, plastics, chemicals, producing all kinds of products from that barrel of oil, they get more than 10 times out of it.
Wow.
In added value. And then they sell it back. They sell those products back to us much, much more expensive than the oil we sell.
Exactly. Yeah.
This goes to all raw materials in Africa. So nations have to retake their natural resources, build infrastructure and energy and transport, educate their labor, and have a more fair, kind of cooperation. The only ones who accepted to build a battery factory in Zimbabwe was China. We said, well, no problem. You sell us
build a factory together. Yeah.
We build the factory together. What is wrong with that? Now, the United States and Britain and others are trying to do the same in the Congo. It's good for the Congo. I mean, if the United States wants to build machinery and other factories in Democratic Republic of Congo, that's fine.
Yeah.
But don't
it's ultimately up to the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo who they want to participate with, right? And I guess we're going to get off. We're not going to have a lot of time. I still want to ask you some questions. Now, you were just speaking with 2 days ago with Eric Solheim, former Undersecretary of the United Nations. Obviously, he cares a lot about the environment, as do all of us. And China is now exporting more solar, on and offshore wind technology, EVs than any other country in the world. And we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. It seems like since maybe 2019 to now, there's been a massive pivot towards the kinds of infrastructure China has been willing to develop with underdeveloped countries towards green energy projects. So what kind of projects how is the Belt and Road moving forward? And I think it's called the Green Belt and Road. How is it now operating, and what are the principles by which it is greening?
This is something which was not very much in the first 10 years of the Belt and Road, but this is something which was promoted last year at the third Belt and Road Forum. And Eric Solheim actually became the I think, vice chairman or chairman of this Green Belt and Road Initiative to get more and more investments into the so-called green technologies, solar, wind, and so on. But I disagree with a lot of this on technical matters, because I think the cleanest energy is hydro and nuclear power. Mm-hmm. Solar and wind don't give so much back. But the Chinese, because they can produce it at a very cost-effective way, and also they can sell a lot of it to other countries. So they are doing that. But I think without coal and oil and gas and hydropower and nuclear power, it's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. But this is a way China wants to show goodwill towards the world, which is saying, okay, we have a climate problem and we need to invest in these clean technologies, solar, wind, and so on. China says, fine, let's do more of this that's what you want. So China is producing more solar and wind, and then suddenly somebody's coming there, a lady with a strange bag, and says, oh, you have overcapacity. It's like, we don't want you to export so much to the world because you are crashing the market. Well, nobody else is producing that. And you are screaming, we want to build the clean technology. So we are doing our best to help you with your goals. These are the goals you set for yourself. You want to become carbon free, but you are not able to produce solar panels and windmills and all that stuff yourself.
Yeah.
That's scale.
Yeah. I want to move to the next question, because I'm going to try to combine two questions. So you recently did an interview with journalist Zain Khan, wherein you discussed the future of the Belt and Road in the next 10 years, which is a huge vantage looking into the future. In terms of what the underdeveloped world needs, what do you see are the next steps for the Belt and Road Initiative and for the Global South in general?
Yeah, I think you put your hand on it. It's called the global south. The next 10 years, because the first 10 years China was like leading alone and doing everything alone, and that's not really sustainable because only Africa is twice as big as China, and the population will be twice as big as China's population by 2050. So China cannot do all these things alone, but it set a good model for cooperation, which many nations are joining. What will happen in the next 10 years is that other actors will get into the Belt and Road as active members, not only China. So there will be an integration of the role of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the new development bank of the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but most importantly, the new members of the BRICS, because in the Gulf countries, alone, the sovereign wealth funds, there are $4 trillion of reserves. And these are about to be used in infrastructure and industry, both in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, the Gulf countries, but also in Africa and other parts where China and those countries can finance infrastructure. So that's why I say the Belt and Road will become more colorful because more nations will be actively participating in it, not only China, but China is solely capable of providing all the technology that is needed. In the next 10 years, there will be more focus on soft infrastructure, telecommunications, capacity building, education, transfer of technology, research and development, and industrialization. Because many nations in Africa, I heard that myself in the Third Belt and Road, like the Ethiopian president, the Argentine president, the previous one, they said, look, we are sick and tired of our raw materials, natural resources being exported very cheap. We want to build industries in our country. Mm-hmm. And I think this is what will going to happen. All countries who have natural wealth, they would prefer to get investments in industries, industrial zones in their own countries to employ their people and raise. So many industrial nations are reluctant to do that, but I think China, even India and others are open for this kind of business because you need to raise the living standard of your clients. You know, if you have clients, they should become richer so they can buy. So China, for example, instead of exporting cheap goods to Africa, it will export the machinery which will produce the cheap goods inside Africa for the African market. This is what's going on already now, but that will accelerate during the next 10 years of the Belt and Road. So it will not only be railways and ports and highways, which should continue because we have a huge deficit still, but there will be more focus on these other parts of production capacity, industrialization, agriculture. Agriculture is going to be very big, actually, export of agricultural technology to Africa so Africans can grow more food. China was open. China needs more food to buy from abroad. Yeah. And the best places the best places are in Africa. African nations can produce food and sell it for good price to China. That's no. So these are the things which will be in the Belt and Road in the next 10 years.
Next question I wanted to ask you, this is, I think, the kind of a broad stroke. Obviously, we're looking at human development. We're looking at quality of life. So these are obvious things that we want to see the underdeveloped world develop for. But there's another angle as well, and that's kind of global peace. So what does the transformation of the developing world under BRICS and BRI, other mechanisms, and multipolarity, what are the prospects for sustaining better global peace, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think there are two main principles. One, which was hard won by humanity through the United Nations Charter, which says that nations are independent and sovereign, and nobody should interfere in their internal affairs, and all conflicts should be solved diplomatically through dialogue. That's very, very important, which was unfortunately violated, especially in the case of my country, Iraq, which was invaded illegally under the pretext of protecting the people of Iraq against their dictator, and changing the government. So this is a very dangerous thing that has happened. The other principle is the question of what we always believed in the Schiller Institute since we were doing this work is peace can only be sustained through economic development. If you don't have economic development, there will be no peace. And I think the Chinese are more and more saying this through the Global Development Initiative, but also Global Security Initiative. Even in the case of Gaza, the Chinese said we need an international conference for peace through economic development. This is something which we support in the Schiller Institute. We have just released a plan, which is called a dated version of the plan called the Oasis Plan, which is based on the development of Palestine, Israel, Syria, Jordan, all these countries as the basis for peace. Not all these questions about borders and so on. A two-state solution is imperative now. The rights of the Palestinian people, according to United Nations resolutions, are imperative. But to sustain peace, we need to have economic development. And that's the very, very important, besides the idea that nations are sovereign and independent. Mm-hmm. So I think these are the most important things. The way to sustain peace is to respect dialogue, respecting the diversity of cultural, social, political systems of other countries. And second is to help nations of the world to develop, because that will be beneficial. You know who said that to Winston Churchill during World War II? It was the American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is one of, in my eyes, the greatest American president. I mean, Americans say it's Abraham Lincoln, but for me, as an outsider, Franklin Delano Roosevelt told Churchill, he said, after this war, there will be no British Empire, there will be no French Empire. We are not going to fight to preserve your empire. The nations of Africa will become free because you are sucking their blood. And what do you get? You get pennies. But if we develop Africa, like we developed the United States, building infrastructure, healthcare, sewage systems, water system, power, we will gain much, much, much more from that kind of cooperation. So this is not something which is new. This is something, unfortunately, President Franklin Roosevelt died before the war was over. So his dream, went to the grave with him, and we had a completely new, like Harry Truman was a very bad person. And then we had the Cold War, and Churchill came back and, he said, we need to have an iron wall. Roosevelt's idea was to work with Russia or Soviet and China. Even had plans to develop China's railways and hydropower and all these things. Like Franklin Roosevelt had his own Belt and Road. So these are things that people need to discuss now, because this is beneficial for the United States and Europe. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying these things because it's good for Africa or China. It's good for me and my children and grandchildren here in Sweden. Yeah. Because we have economic and social problems because of our tendency for deindustrialization and preventing others from development. Mm-hmm. And this is affecting us now. And we also have huge security and other problems like the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And, so we are worried also about ourselves. We are not only worried about what happens to people in Africa or Iraq. I'm an Iraqi citizen, but I'm also a Swedish citizen. Mm-hmm. I care about this country.
I mean, I just want to reframe. I want to reframe it, what you said, because I agree with you. I mean, one of the things the United States tries to say is there are security issues. That's its excuse for going around the world and doing police work, as it likes to imagine itself. And, to me, if you can develop all of these other places, and, after World War II, there was the Marshall Plan, right, to develop redevelop Western Europe. And Western Europe became a haven of peace. Imagine an entire world where everywhere was developed. Then would the world become a haven of peace? I mean, I think that is kind of the idea that we're going at here. By developing everywhere, then there are no security issues because everyone is relatively content with life, and that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly it. And also there's, of course, we understand, we have studied this, there's two different philosophical tendencies and looking at the world, is that on the one side, you have this Hobbesian, the British Empire ideology that the nations are always at war with each other, they're egoistic, and they, it's a zero-sum game. And you have to undermine others and support yourself. The other philosophy says, no, we can have a community of sovereign nations, like the James Madison and others said, where sovereign nations can actually support each other to survive because their prosperity becomes your prosperity.
Right.
This is what the Chinese are saying today, said, we will not be prosperous unless you are prosperous.
Yes.
So there's these two different tendencies also need to be resolved, because this is a deep cultural and philosophical fight. The world is not so small. The pie can be made bigger. We don't need to fight over a small pie. Make the pie bigger, make many pies, and let's share it. The world is very big and big enough for everyone.
Thank you so much for your time, Hussein Askari.